Get ready for the unknown. If you love feeling the chill down your spine and venturing into stories that will take your sleep away, subscribe to our channel now and activate the bell. Don't miss the next horror tales that will take you to the darkest corners of your mind. Are you ready to face your fears? Portal is open. Enter. On the night of their 16th birthday, James and Charles decided to go for a walk in the woods. It was a tradition they had created to venture out into the darkness and feel the adrenaline rush of being alone in the unknown. The moonlight was weak and the wind blew through the trees with a soft moan. They were walking in silence when suddenly a figure appeared on the path ahead. It was a woman, but something was deeply wrong. Her skin was wrinkled, like old leather, and her eyes, deep and empty, shone with an unnatural light. She smiled, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. "Who are you?" James asked, his voice trembling. The woman laughed, a grotesque sound that reverberated through the forest. "Don't you know? I'm the one your grandmother tried to forget." Before they could react, two other figures emerged from the shadows, equally hideous and deformed, with bodies that seemed to twist under their filthy robes. The witches were far worse than any tale they had ever heard. The smell of rot filled the air as the creatures advanced. The brothers tried to run, but it was too late. The witches moved with supernatural speed, grabbing them with bony, cold hands. Panic seized them as they were dragged into the darkness. Their voices were lost in the forest, and the fear that was once just a story to scare children became real. Terror wasn't just lurking. It had captured them. James and Charles woke up in a dark, damp place. The metallic smell of blood permeated the air, and when they opened their eyes, they realized they were in a vast, dark cave. The floor was covered in bones and decomposing corpses, evidence that many other victims had passed through. The brothers' hearts beat wildly as their eyes adjusted to the dim light. Around them, large cauldrons boiled with thick liquids, and shelves were filled with macabre ingredients: human skulls, organs, and nauseatingly colored potions. The witches, with their twisted bodies and hungry eyes, circled the space. One of them, the tallest, spoke in a voice that seemed to drip with evil. "You were chosen for the ritual. Your grandmother escaped, but you won't be as lucky." The others laughed, their laughter full of cruelty and madness. The witches began to prepare the ritual, mixing disgusting ingredients and chanting in an ancient and indecipherable language. James and Charles were tied up, unable to move. Absolute terror overwhelmed them. "What are we going to do?" whispered Charles, tears streaming down his face. James, though just as terrified as his brother, tried to think of a way out. He remembered the stories his grandmother had told him about how he had escaped. "We need time," he replied, his eyes frantically searching for something, anything, that he could use to free himself. Deep down, they both knew that they weren't just fighting for their lives. Something much worse was at stake. The witches began to approach the brothers, muttering in unison. One of them held a long, rusty dagger, while another drew macabre symbols on the ground around them. The ritual, as ancient as the evil it represented, was about to begin. "With your blood we will bring back our power," whispered the older witch, as the dagger gleamed in the cauldron's light. James struggled against his bonds, panic growing by the second. He couldn't let it happen, but he was paralyzed by fear. Charles, beside him, prayed silently, his whispered words almost inaudible. As the witches chanted their curses, something stirred at the bottom of the cave. A current of cold wind swept through the place, and the witches stopped momentarily, as if something unexpected was happening. Suddenly, a burst of light illuminated the cave. James and Charles saw, to their surprise, a familiar figure at the entrance. It was their grandmother, Margareth. Her expression was one of sheer terror, but her eyes were full of determination. "You won't have them," she shouted, holding up something that looked like an ancient, glowing amulet. The witches recoiled momentarily, their faces contorted with rage. Margareth knew that their power was still strong, but there was one last hope. Margareth advanced quickly, the amulet glowing brightly. "I escaped you before, and I won't let you take my grandchildren," she shouted, her voice firm. The witches, now furious, tried to advance, but something in the amulet kept them at bay. James and Charles, still trapped, stared at their grandmother in shock. Everything she had told them was true, and now she was risking her life to save them. The amulet in her hands glowed with an intense light, something that witches seemed to fear. "Don't you understand?" growled the oldest witch. "She's bound to us. Her escape was never complete." Margareth knew this to be true. When she had escaped decades ago, part of her soul had remained trapped in that unfinished ritual. And now, the witches wanted to complete what they had started. "I don't care," replied Margareth, her voice shaky but firm. "I'll give you what you want, but leave the children." The witches, seeing an opportunity, smiled mischievously. "If you give yourself up, maybe we'll spare your grandchildren," hissed one of them. When James heard this, he shouted, "No, Granny, you can't do that." But Margaret had already made up her mind. She slowly approached, placing the amulet on the ground. "Is this what you want?" The light from the amulet began to fade, and the witches slowly advanced, their claws ready to claim what they had waited so long for. Margareth knew she couldn't turn back. As she placed the amulet on the ground, she felt the darkness of the cave closing in on her, as if something was taking over her body. The witches, now smiling, stepped forward, stretching out their hands to absorb the energy that Margareth had retained for so many years. "With your soul, we will be whole again," whispered one of them, her eyes fixed on the imminent sacrifice. But before they could complete the ritual, Margareth, with a final sigh, lifted the amulet one last time and broke it. The cave was filled with an intense light, an explosion of energy that made the witches scream in pain. Their connection to the physical world was broken, and their grotesque bodies began to crumble, turning to dust before the boys' eyes. Margaret fell to the ground, exhausted, her frail body consumed by magic. James and Charles, now free. James and Charles, now free of their chains, ran to their grandmother. Margaret's body was weak, her face pale and aged beyond normal. Her eyes, however, still shone with a mixture of sadness and relief. "Grandma, you did this for us," said James, tears streaming down his face. Charles, still in shock, held her trembling hand, feeling his grandmother's strength slowly fade away. "I did what needed to be done," whispered Margareth, her voice now a distant echo in the cold cave. The cave, which had once pulsed with a dark and lively energy, was now silent. The potions, ingredients, and bones scattered on the floor seemed to have lost their color, as if the magic that fed them had been extinguished. The witches, now reduced to dust, had finally disappeared. "The ritual is broken." "You're safe now," murmured Margaret, closing her eyes as her breathing became weaker. James and Charles knew that their grandmother had sacrificed everything to save them, but the cost had been too high. The silence that followed was filled only by the sound of their sobs as they held their grandmother in their arms, aware that this was their last moment with her. "She saved us," said Charles, his voice breaking. James agreed, but deep down he felt a growing fear. He knew the battle had been won, but something still troubled him. As they lifted Margaret's body out of the cave, the moonlight penetrated the darkness. The way back seemed long and heavy, and each step echoed like a reminder of the sacrifice they had witnessed. However, the air was lighter, and the oppressive feeling that had surrounded the brothers disappeared. The danger seemed to have finally passed, but inside them, something was different. The scars the witches had left would not be easily healed. Weeks had passed since the terrible encounter with the witches, but the nightmare continued to haunt the brothers' dreams. James woke up every night to the sound of distant laughter, as if the witches were still lurking around, waiting for something. Charles, on the other hand, became even more introspective. He rarely talked about what happened in the cave and avoided mentioning his grandmother. There was something he couldn't express, a feeling that the ritual hadn't been completely undone. One evening, while the two of them were sitting in the living room, Charles finally broke the silence. "James, do you feel that? Something is still wrong?" His eyes, full of doubt, met his brother's. James hesitated. "Yes, I feel as if they're still around. Maybe not physically, but somehow, I feel like what happened to Grandma didn't end there." The brothers decided to go back to their grandmother's house. They needed answers, something to help them understand why the feeling of unease was still hanging over them. While rummaging through Margaret's old belongings, they found an old diary, covered in dust, hidden behind a cupboard. The diary was full of detailed notes about witches, the ritual Margareth had escaped, and the dark secrets that had haunted her since her youth. One passage caught James's eye. The one who breaks the ritual bears the mark of the curse forever. Even in death, they can return through those who have been touched by their magic. As they read these words, the brothers froze. Their grandmother's sacrifice had saved their lives, but the curse had not been completely destroyed. They had been marked. The witches could return at any time, not as before, but through them. With the discovery of the diary, James and Charles began to notice subtle changes in themselves. Small, almost imperceptible signs began to manifest themselves. Strange dreams, where the witches' voices echoed in their minds like inviting whispers. "You're ours now," they said. During the day, the brothers began to feel a cold, almost invisible presence that followed them wherever they went. James, always the more rational one, tried to push these thoughts away, but the darkness seemed to infiltrate every aspect of his life. Charles, on the other hand, began to isolate himself. He spent hours locked in his room, drawing symbols that appeared in his dreams, figures he couldn't understand. One day, James entered his room and found one of the drawings, a familiar figure of a witch with long fingers, holding a dagger that pointed directly at Charles's heart. "These images, what do they mean?" asked James, terrified. Charles, his face pale, just stared at him. "I can't stop, James. They're inside me." The truth began to become undeniable. Margaret's sacrifice had saved their lives, but now the witches possessed them in a way they couldn't help. They weren't dead, they just lay dormant inside them, waiting for the right moment to break free. Knowing that they were running out of time, the brothers decided to seek help. They remembered a woman their grandmother had mentioned in her diary. An old friend of Margareth's, known only as Agnes, who lived in isolation in the forest, in the mountains. Margareth had described Agnes as the only one who knew the witches' deepest secrets, and perhaps she could break the mark that haunted them. The journey to Agnes's house was long and full of uncertainty. The path was steep and surrounded by dead trees, as if nature itself had been poisoned by the curse that followed them. When they arrived at Agnes' hut, they were greeted by an old woman with a penetrating gaze full of wisdom. "I knew you would come," she said, in a voice that seemed to echo in the forest. "You carry the mark. Margareth tried to protect you, but the evil that dwells in your hearts cannot be erased so easily." Agnes led them into a small room, full of mystical symbols and burning candles. "There is a way to remove the mark," she explained, as she prepared an ancient ritual. "But the cost will be high. You must decide if you are willing to face evil directly, because once the ritual begins, there will be no turning back." James and Charles looked at each other, knowing that they were facing their last chance. Fear consumed them, but they also knew they had no choice. The witches were getting stronger and stronger, and time was running out. With trembling hands, James and Charles agreed to take part in the ritual. Agnes began chanting words in an ancient language, while the symbols on the floor glowed with a supernatural light. The air around them began to vibrate, and the temperature in the hut dropped dramatically. Suddenly, the witches' voices echoed through the room, full of hatred and despair. "You can't destroy us. We are eternal." The brothers felt a crushing weight on their chests, as if something was being torn from their souls. Charles began to scream, feeling the witches struggle to stay inside him. "I can't take it anymore," he cried, while James, fighting the same terror, held his brother's hand tightly. "Hang on, Charles. We're almost there." The light in the hut exploded in a wave of energy, and the witches' voices suddenly fell silent. The silence that followed was deafening. When the light finally faded, the brothers were exhausted but alive. Agnes, pale and sweaty, smiled faintly. "They're gone. You're free, for now." The brothers knew that the evil that had haunted them all their lives had been broken, but they also knew that, somewhere, the witches were still lurking, waiting for the right moment to try to return.